The Battle of Long Tan took place in a rubber plantation near Long Tan, in Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The action was fought between Australian forces and Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units after 108 men from D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment clashed with a force of 1,500 to 2,500 from the Viet Cong 275th Regiment, possibly reinforced by at least one North Vietnamese battalion, and D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion. The first Australian task force had arrived between April and June 1966, constructing a base at Nui Dat. After 2 months it had moved beyond the initial requirements of establishing itself and securing its immediate approaches, beginning operations to open the province. Meanwhile, in response to the threat posed by 1 ATF, the 275th Regiment was ordered to move against Nui Dat. For several weeks Australian signals intelligence had tracked a radio transmitter moving westwards to a position just north of Long Tan. However, extensive patrolling failed to find the unit. At 2:43 on the night of 16-17 August, Viet Cong mortars, recoilless rifles and artillery heavily bombarded Nui Dat from a position 2,000 meters to the east, before being engaged by counter-battery fire. The following morning B Company, 6 Ra departed Nui Dat to locate the firing points and the direction of the Viet Cong withdrawal. A number of weapon pits were subsequently found, as were the positions of the mortars and RCLs. D Company took over the pursuit around midday on the 18th of August. At 15:40 the lead element, 11 Platoon, clashed with the Viet Cong squad, forcing them to withdraw. Shortly after resuming the advance, at 16:08 the platoon came under small arms and rocket-propelled grenade fire from a flank after drawing ahead of the other platoons and was isolated. Pinned down, they called for artillery support as a monsoon rain began, reducing visibility. Beginning as an encounter battle, heavy fighting ensued as the advancing battalions of the Viet Cong 275th Regiment attempted to encircle and destroy the Australians. After less than 20 minutes, more than a third of 11 platoon had become casualties, while the platoon commander was killed soon after. 10 platoon moved up on the left in support but was repulsed. With D Company facing a much larger force, 12 platoon tried to push up on the right at 17:15, fighting off an attack on their right before pushing forward another 100 meters. They sustained increasing casualties after clashing with several groups moving around their western flank to form a cutoff prior to a frontal assault, opening a path to 11 platoon. Yet unable to advance further, they threw smoke to mark their location. Nearly out of ammunition, at 1802 UH-1B Iroquois from No. 9 Squadron RAF arrived overhead to resupply D Company. Meanwhile, the survivors from 11 platoon withdrew to 12 platoon during a lull, suffering further losses. Still heavily engaged, both platoons then moved back to the company position covered by artillery. By 1810 D Company had reformed but was still in danger of being overrun. A company, 6 Ra, was dispatched in M113 armored personnel carriers from 3 Troop, 1st APC Squadron to reinforce them. Meanwhile, B Company headquarters and 1 platoon were still returning to base and were also ordered to assist. Leaving Nui Dat at 17:55, the carriers moved east, crossing a swollen creek before encountering elements of D-445 Battalion attempting to outflank D Company and assault it from the rear. The Viet Cong were caught by surprise as the cavalry crashed into their flank, and with darkness falling they broke through, while B Company entered the position at 1900. Arriving at a crucial point, the relief force turned the tide of the battle. The Viet Cong had been massing for another assault which would have likely destroyed D Company. Yet the firepower and mobility of the armor broke their will, forcing them to withdraw. Continuing past D Company, the relief force assaulted the Viet Cong, before moving back to the company position at 1910. The artillery had been almost constant throughout and proved critical in ensuring the survival of D Company. By 1915 the firing had ceased and the Australians waited for another attack. However, after no counter-attack occurred, they prepared to withdraw 750 meters west. With the dead and wounded loaded onto the carriers, D Company left at 22:45, while B and A Company departed on foot. A landing zone was then established by the cavalry with the evacuation of the casualties finally completed after midnight. Forming a defensive position ready to repulse an expected attack, they remained overnight, enduring the cold and heavy rain. The Australians returned in strength the next day, sweeping the area and locating a large number of Viet Cong dead, although initially believing they had suffered a major defeat. As the scale of the Viet Cong's losses were revealed, it became clear they had won a significant victory. 2 wounded Viet Cong were killed after they moved to engage the Australians, while 3 were captured. The bodies of the missing from 11 platoon were also located. 2 men had survived despite their wounds, having spent the night in close proximity to the Viet Cong as they attempted to evacuate their own casualties. Due to the likely presence of a sizable force nearby, the Australians remained cautious as they searched for the Viet Cong. Over the next 2 days they continued to clear the battlefield, uncovering more dead as they did so. Yet with 1 ATF lacking the resources to pursue the withdrawing force, the operation ended on the 21st of August. Heavily outnumbered but supported by strong artillery fire, D Company held off her regimental assault before a relief force of cavalry and infantry fought their way through and forced the Viet Cong to withdraw. 18 Australians were killed and 24 wounded, while the Viet Cong lost at least 245 dead, which were found over the days that followed. A decisive Australian victory, Long Tan proved a major local setback for the Viet Cong, indefinitely forestalling an imminent movement against Nui Dat and establishing the task force's dominance over the province. Although there were other large-scale encounters in later years, 1 ATF was not fundamentally challenged again. Background: military situation. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had been assisting South Vietnamese forces since 1962 as part of the wider U.S. advisory effort. However, in April 1965, ground troops were committed as the worsening situation in Vietnam led to a significant escalation of the war. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was dispatched with engineers, cavalry, artillery and aviation elements in support, totaling 1,400 personnel. 1 RA would be attached to the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade based in Bien Hoa, a formation which operated throughout 3rd Corps Tactical Zone. Unlike later Australian units that served in Vietnam, which included conscripts, it was manned by regular personnel only. The battalion would be employed in airmobile search and destroy operations using helicopters to insert light infantry and artillery into an area of operations and support them with mobility, fire support, casualty evacuation, and resupply. Commencing in late June, 1 RA conducted operations into War Zone D and the Iron Triangle, with actions including the Battle of Gang Toi on 8 November and Operation New Life in the Lane, Na Valley, 75 kilometers northeast of Bien Hoa between the 21st of November and the 16th of December. Operation Marauder was launched on the Plain of Reeds in the Mekong Delta on New Year's Day 1966 and continued until the 7th of January. 1 RA then took part in Operation Crimp in the Hobo Woods, north of CUK over the period 8 to 14 January. Further fighting followed, with the Battle of Sua Bong Trang on the night of 23–24 February 1966. At the strategic level, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and the South Vietnamese government had both rallied after appearing on the verge of collapse, and the threat to Saigon subsided by late 1965. Yet further troop increases were required if General William Westmoreland, commander USMACV, was to adopt a more offensive strategy, with U.S. forces planned to rise from 210,000 in January 1966 to 327,000 by December. The Australian government increased its own commitment on 8 March 1966. Announcing that 1 RA would be replaced at the end of its tour by a 2-battalion brigade, the 1st Australian Task Force, with armour, aviation, engineers and artillery support, in total 4,500 men. Additional Royal Australian Air Force and Royal Australian Navy elements would also be deployed, with total Australian strength in Vietnam planned to rise to 6,300. Meanwhile, 1 RAR's attachment to U.S. forces had highlighted the differences between Australian and American operational methods. Whereas the Americans relied on massed firepower and mobility in big unit search and destroy operations as part of a war of attrition which often resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. The Australians, although not eschewing conventional operations, emphasized deliberate patrolling using dispersed companies supported by artillery, APCs and helicopters to separate the Viet Cong from the population in the villages, while slowly extending government control. Consequently, 1 ATF would be allocated its own tactical area of responsibility in Phuoc Tuy Province, thereby allowing them to pursue operations more independently using their own methods. By 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province was dominated by the Viet Cong, with forces dispersed across South Vietnam to defend against the growing communist insurgency. The ARVN was stretched with only limited resources available to counter penetration of the province. Politically, Phuoc Tuy was controlled by the province chief, an army officer appointed by the central government, and was divided into 5 districts, each with the district chief. Although the government controlled Baria and the Vung Tau Special Zone, it only partially controlled the village of Long Dien, the western parts of Dat Du and the villages of Long Hai, Zuyen Moc and Phu Mai during the day. Only the route from Baria to Vung Tau was secure, and beyond this South Vietnamese forces were likely to be ambushed, although the mostly Catholic village of Binh Gia opposed communist influence. It was isolated with the Viet Cong cadres controlling the remainder of the province, collecting taxes and subjecting the population to extortion and violent intimidation. The Viet Cong operated in parallel to the South Vietnamese administration, part of the larger communist province of Ba Long, which also included Long Can, and part of Bien Hoa Province. The Ba Long Province People's Committee coordinated activity in Phuoc Tuy under the direction of the Central Office for South Vietnam, an organization controlled by North Vietnam. Meanwhile, a network of cells and committees known as the Viet Cong Infrastructure provided support and extended control into the villages and hamlets. The military forces which supported the political apparatus consisted of main forces, local forces and guerrillas. Collectively they comprised the People's Liberation Armed Forces. Although purportedly separate from the People's Army of Vietnam, the North Vietnamese increasingly provided reinforcements to the Viet Cong, while PAVN units themselves would operate in Phuoc Tuy in later years. The southernmost province in 3CTZ, Phuoc Tuy, had been selected by the Australians because it was an area of significant Viet Cong activity, was located away from the Cambodian border, could be resupplied and, if necessary, evacuated by sea, and enabled them to concentrate their efforts in a single area to achieve greater national recognition, rather than being attached to a U.S. division. Negotiations between senior Australian and U.S. commanders ensured 1 ATF would be an independent command under the operational control of U.S. 2 Field Force Vietnam, a corps-level headquarters based in Bien Hoa which reported directly to Commander USMACV. This would allow the force greater freedom of action and the chance to demonstrate the Australian Army's evolving concept for counterinsurgency warfare. developed in part from its operations during the Malayan Emergency. The task force would be commanded by Brigadier David Jackson, an experienced infantry officer who had served in the Middle East and New Guinea during the Second World War, and later in Korea, and commanded the AATTV and Australian Army Force Vietnam prior to taking up the appointment. However, with the new force given less than 2 months to deploy, hasty preparations began in Australia to ready it. Meanwhile, UNRWA continued to operate alongside U.S. forces. Over the period 9 to 22 March it was involved in Operation Silver City, 25 kilometers north of Bien Hoa in War Zone D, under command of the U.S. 1st Division. In late March 2 brigades of the U.S. 1st Division, reinforced by the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade and South Vietnamese units, conducted Operation Abilene, a search-and-destroy mission through Phuoc Tuy Province, targeting the 274th and 275th Regiments of the Viet Cong 5th Division and their base areas in the Mai Tao Secret Zone. UNRWA was tasked with defending a divisional fire support and logistic base in the Courtney rubber plantation and later conducted a cordon search of Bin Ba. Yet, the Viet Cong largely avoided battle, and contact with the sweeping U.S. brigades was light. On the morning of the 11th of April, elements of the U.S. 216th Infantry Battalion clashed with D-800 Battalion at Cam Mai in fierce close-quarters fighting. During the only major action, with both sides too close for American firepower to be effective, casualties were heavy. Viet Cong losses included 41 confirmed dead and possibly another 50, while 35 Americans were killed. In preparation for 180F's arrival, the 1,000 inhabitants of the fortified Viet Cong village of Long Tan were then forcibly removed and resettled nearby, and the buildings destroyed by the ARVN. The Australians were also heavily engaged, with the fighting resulting in 14 Viet Cong killed, 12 wounded and 33 captured. UNRWA lost 4 wounded. Terrain located 40 kilometers southeast of Saigon. Phuoc Tuy Province lay on the coast between the mountains of southern central Vietnam and the alluvial plains of the Mekong Delta, dominating the approaches to Vung Tau and the main highway to the capital. Approximately 60 kilometers east to west and 35 kilometers north to south, it was roughly rectangular, mostly flat. It gradually sloped north, while the Nui Thi, Mai Tao and Long Hai mountains rose in the southwest, northeast and south. The province was bounded to the north by Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Tuy provinces, and to the southeast by the South China Sea. Separate administratively, the Vung Tau Peninsula projected south, with the city of Vung Tau at its tip containing a shallow water port of strategic importance due to its capacity to relieve congestion on the Saigon River. Phuoc Tuy was bisected by Route 2 running north to the provincial capital of Baria, while Route 15 ran northwest linking Vung Tau to Saigon and was the main supply route for the movement of stores landed at the port, and Route 23 ran east from Baria. With just a quarter of the province used for agriculture, it supported a modest population of 104,636. Most of which was concentrated in the southwest in approximately 30 villages and 100 hamlets, with major settlements at Baria, Long Dien, Dat Du, Bin Gia and Zuyen Moc. The majority were Vietnamese, while there were small numbers of Chinese, Montagnards, Cambodians and French. 2/3 were Buddhist, while the remainder were Catholic. Most lived in poverty as farmers, fishermen, laborers, merchants or mechanics. Rice growing was the main industry, although fruit and vegetables were also cultivated, and coastal fishing was extensive. Meanwhile, charcoal kilns, sawmills, salt evaporation ponds and rubber plantations also provided employment. Geographically, the province was ideal for guerrilla warfare, consisting of flat, open farmland and rice fields with numerous villages and small settlements. a long and mostly uninhabited coastline aside from the port of Vung Tau and the fishing villages of Lang Phuoc Hai and Long Hai, and a region of mangrove swamp and waterways in the southwest known as the Rung Sat, both of which aided infiltration. Meanwhile, isolated and densely vegetated mountains provided supply routes and base areas. Rainforest, thick scrub and grassland covered almost three-quarters of the province, in places restricting movement of tracked and wheeled vehicles, limiting visibility to close range and providing extensive concealment. In the lowlands, the vegetation provided little obstacle to either mounted or dismounted movement, although a number of watercourses and streams were difficult to traverse, particularly during the wet season, with four major rivers flowing north to south being the Song Hoa, Song Ray, Song Ba Dap and Song Din. Phuoc Tuy had a tropical climate, with the monsoon lasting from mid-May to the end of October, which resulted in several hours of heavy rain up to twice a day, while the dry season lasted from October to May. The Viet Cong and their predecessors, the Viet Minh, had dominated Phuoc Tuy since 1945. As a consequence, the local population had a long tradition of resistance to the former French colonial administration, while communist revolutionary elements later challenged repeated attempts by the ARVN to bring the province under control of the central government. In Saigon, by comparison, Vung Tau was largely free from Viet Cong activity and several large Allied military installations had been established there. A popular seaside resort with many bars and nightclubs, it was rumored to have been used as a rest center by both Allied and Viet Cong soldiers.